Now I want to highlight this theme that I skipped over, but is really crucial. And that's the theme of exile. Do you see that? Go back to verse 17. He says, I want you to conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. Now, what's Peter talking about here? What exile is he referring to? Well, if you read the Old Testament, especially the books of Kings, you'll learn about the two exiles of Israel. So you have the Assyrian exile. It takes place in 722 BC when the 10 northern tribes are scattered to the four winds by the Assyrian Empire among the Gentiles. And then a few hundred years later, in 586 BC, you have the more famous Babylonian exile, which takes place when the two southern tribes, or the two remaining tribes of Judah and Benjamin, are also brought into exile by Babylon, by the Babylonian Empire, and the temple is destroyed. Now, after that Babylonian exile ends, some of the people of Judah come back to the Promised Land and they rebuild the temple. But there's still this expectation, this realization, I should say, that the majority of the 12 tribes are still scattered and mixed among the Gentiles. They're lost. This is the origin of the lost tribes of Israel. And this is going to become a particularly palpable reality, especially in the first century, because at the time of the Roman occupation of Israel, in the first century BC, and then continuing in the first century AD, lots of Jews end up living outside the land. So there is a very large Jewish population in major Roman cities throughout the empire. So there's Jewish population in Rome. There are Jewish synagogues in Asia Minor. We see Paul travel to them in the book of Acts. There's an enormous, well, not enormous, but a large Jewish community in northern Egypt, in Alexandria. These Jewish communities are called the diaspora. It's from the Greek word diaspora, which literally means to be scattered or dispersed. So you'll sometimes see this referred to as the dispersion. More commonly, scholars will call it the Jewish diaspora. It just means the Jews who have been dispersed throughout the Gentile lands. Well, if you go back and look, you'll note that in 1 Peter chapter 1, the audience of this letter is explicitly identified as members of the diaspora. It says this in 1 Peter 1. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the exiles of the dispersion in Greek diaspora in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, chosen and destined by God the Father and sanctioned by the Spirit for obedience to Jesus Christ for sprinkling with his blood. So, since ancient times, the letter of Peter has been read as a letter written to Jews in the diaspora. But to Jewish believers in Christ, who are members of this diaspora, living among the Gentile nations, but are Jewish people of faith. Now, one reason that's significant, as I mentioned elsewhere, but I'll say it again, is that if you recall in the letter to the Galatians, before Paul gets in his little conflict with Peter, it says that Paul went down to Jerusalem and had a conference with Peter, James, and John. And there was an agreement between them that Peter and James and John would minister to the circumcised and Paul to the uncircumcised. So there was a kind of division of labor that took place, that the pillars, Peter, James, and John, would be apostles to the Jews and Paul would be an apostle to the Gentiles. Now, that doesn't mean that Peter never talked to Gentiles or that Paul never talked to Jews. We see that Paul would always go to synagogues in the cities that he evangelized, but he saw his principal mission as being to the nations and Peter's mission being to the circumcised. So, since ancient times, the Catholic epistles, James, Peter, and John, and Jude, although everybody forgets about Jude, have been seen as written primarily to Jewish believers in Christ, whereas the Pauline letters are written to Gentile believers, reflecting those two missions. So here, a case can be made that Peter is written to Jews in the dispersion, living in Asia Minor primarily, but in these Gentile communities. So that's one level on a historical level. But there's another element to this, which is that Peter is using the image of exile to describe not just exile from the earthly promised land, but the exile of being in this world rather than in the world to come, of living in this age rather than in the age to come, of having faith, like we see he says here, in the things that are invisible and in the promised land that we can't yet see. So if you want an example of this, you can see, for example, in Hebrews chapter 11, there's a similar language of exile that takes place. So if you just turn there for a second, just to shed a little light on this text. Hebrews 11, 13 to 16. Listen to this. This is describing Abraham as an exile, and it says, Abraham and Sarah, and like the other righteous people, these all died in faith, not having received what was promised, but having seen it and greeted it from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus, make it clear that they're seeking a homeland. If they'd been thinking about the land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. So notice what Hebrews is doing. It's taking the language of faith and the language of exile and applying it to Abraham and the Old Testament saints, and saying, even though they were in the promised land, they were still exiles. Because although they were living on earth in the earthly promised land, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly homeland, a heavenly promised land. I would submit to you that the same thing is true here in the letter of Peter. When he says, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile, he doesn't just mean earthly exile from the earthly promised land. He means earthly exile from the heavenly promised land to which Christ will gather his people when he comes again in glory. Now, the reason that's so significant, for me at least, is that the word for exile, are you ready for this? I don't know if you're ready, it's important. It's paroikos. Paroikos. It literally means to live beside a house. Par means next to or beside, and oikos means a house. So if you live or dwell beside a home, it means you don't have a home yourself, right? Okay, so a person who is in exile doesn't have a home. Well, what's fascinating about this, and I owe this insight to this wonderful commentary in 1st and 2nd Peter by Daniel Keating, he talks about the implications of this terminology because paroikia, or exile, is where we get the English word parish from. A parochial school is a parish, or a school of exiles. A parish is a community of exiles. It's a place where those of us who are exiles on earth and who long for a heavenly promised land gather together as we journey toward that heavenly promised land. So this is Dan Keating in his commentary. He says this, quote, sojourning is literally dwelling beside, paroikia. Why is this instructive? Our English word parish derives from paroikia. The local church, our parish, is meant to be the gathering of Christian sojourners and aliens who are far from their true home. And what is our true home? It is where God dwells. Stop there for a second. I don't know about you, but I'm not sure that's how most Catholics think about their parish, right? It's so easy for us to think about the parish purely as the local community or as the institution where we participate. And it's all those things. But it's helpful for us to remember that our parish is literally a gathering of exiles, of immigrants, of aliens, of people who don't have a home in this world because we're all journeying toward the world to come. I think that just gives a whole different connotation to what we mean when we talk about what that parish community is.